Throughout the history of the game, there have been many meta decks that have competed at the highest level, winning tournament after tournament and competing at SJCs and YCSs. But only a small handful of decks have truly stood the test of time, saying that their reign has spanned an enormous amount of time, more than a single format, more than maybe two formats, maybe stretching into even years at times, while most of the other decks have descended into the depths of obscurity. Here I collect the top 10 decks that I feel have had the greatest longevity in the game. Starting off our list at number 10, we have Dragon Rulers. This is an infamous deck who have surprisingly actually lived a lot longer as a deck than you would expect, given the tremendous amount of hits to the deck, ban list after ban list. I want to say that Rulers probably had the most hits from the ban list directly, more than any other deck in the game ever. I think that even Teledad and Goat can't even compare to the number of hits that Dragon Rulers took directly to their deck. But that speaks volumes about the resiliency of the deck itself. Resiliency is not necessarily longevity, so let's look at the longevity of the deck. I can easily count at least 4 formats worth of time where the deck was most certainly competitively usable, if not the outright best deck of that format. The initial introduction of Dragon Rulers is an obvious example, of course, but the following format was also dominated by Dragon Ruler variants, namely Ravine Rulers. Even following that and leading into the pre-Duelist Alliance format, Dragon Rulers found viability being played with Hieratics and then eventually combined with Lightsworn into the deck known as Rulersworn, also known as Soul Charge deck. Honestly, Rulersworn was one of the coolest concepts as a deck, I think, in the game ever, in my honest opinion. Think about it for a second. You have Judgment Dragon, arguably one of the most fearsome dragons in the game, joining forces with the 4 elemental dragons to form a deck that was frighteningly fast and could OTK with insane ease. Some people have even opted to add Dark Armed Dragon to this deck just to round out all 6 attributes. Oh, and actually there were a couple of other ruler decks that were used as well. Mythic Rulers were used sporadically through the viable time of the deck, and the last meta-level version of Dragon Rulers was Dark Matter Rulers, which probably was the deck that finally got them banned. Rulers are obviously dead now with the ban list hits, and as a result, they have ended up at the bottom of this list. Had they still had some of their Dragon Rulers, they probably would have ended up higher, but as a result of the deck basically being essentially dead, I can't put them any higher than 10th on this list. But nonetheless, the deck is definitely one of the most longest-lived decks in the entire game. Number 9. Next up, we have Wineups, which actually were viable in approximately 4 formats as well, but they outright dominated 2 of these formats. One, of course, was during their initial introduction, where they brought one of the game's most dreaded combos, the Windup Hunter hand combo, which essentially ripped 3 cards out of your opponent's starting hand. And also, remember that this was before the new draw rule was implemented. So this meant that you were starting with 3 cards to your opponent's 6, making the combo even more devastating once it was performed against you. Wineups also played one of the best grind games that I've ever seen as well, netting tons of free pluses from everywhere, meaning that starting down in card advantage against them was essentially a lost game. As a result though, this combo was quickly neutered, but Wineups still remained a strong deck after that. And honestly, I think that the second coming of Wineups was even scarier and more powerful likely, because this time they had Shockmaster on their side, producing yet another devastating first turn combo. This was termed the Shock Lock, where you would damper anything your opponent could do before they even had a single turn. Banless hits followed, and the loss of their party boat, though, kept Wineups away from the meta for some time. But give them a few pieces back, I think, and they can definitely be up and viable once again. Obviously, I think power creep has been taken to a point where Wineups still probably can't compete very well if they don't get their key broken pieces back, like the Hunter Loop or the Shock Lock. But outside of that, the deck is still capable of spamming out rank 4 XYZs, which is definitely a good thing in this game. Moving on to number 8, we have Lightsworn. From the original deck based on Celestia to Judgment Dragon Turbo to the French Twilight deck of 2009 and 2010, all the way to the Godsworn and Rulersworn decks that we saw in hat format, Lightsworn are a deck that have been with us in the metagame ever since their release in Light of Destruction. While they weren't always the best deck, they most certainly have always seen play with at least a smidge of viability. Ironically, at their release though, they were hated by a majority of players. That is, the majority that didn't own them or play them, most likely. They were often scoffed as the Lightsworn deck, praying for good mills so that they could drop Judgment Dragon and call Armageddon on the game. What was most heartbreaking was when opponents top-decked a live Judgment Dragon and dropped it for a game that had all been sealed up had it not been for that lucky draw the cards. One of the most frustrating things was obviously Judgment Dragon, but also the fact that it could be dropped multiple times with multiple copies, setting up for potentially 9,000 damage in one combo, basically a lethal OTK at any number of life points. Before Burning Abyss existed, Lightsworn was the de facto engine used for milling decks. Decks like zombies or anything that relied on the graveyard could tech in Lightsworn to be used as a milling engine just to power through your graveyard. Even to this day, decks like Infernoids still use a couple of the Lightsworn cards just to speed up and power through their deck. For number 7, we have Six Samurai. Six Samurai hold the distinction of being the only deck to win both an SJC and a YCS. I believe that this fact still stands to this day. Monarchs could potentially change this, but surprisingly, they haven't been able to win a YCS yet, despite major tournament presence. With that, you know Samurai have been around for quite some time if they won an SJC. And for those of you that didn't know, SJCs were basically the YCSs held under UDE, and it was an acronym for Shonen Jump Championship. After Konami took over around 2010, this series was replaced with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Championship series that we know and love today. Now, I digress a little bit, but I actually want to tell you guys an interesting story about the first and only SJC that Six Samurai won. It actually was a tad controversial and somewhat comical because many players at the time, and even today, consider that win a fluke. I'll probably go over this in more detail once I get to this point in time in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, but I do want to talk about it a little bit here. This was back in the format of February 2008, which for those of you who don't know, was a format plagued and dominated by Perfect Circle Monarch, which essentially used Stratos to search Disc Commander, which was dumped via Destiny Draw before reviving it with the plethora of a revival that was available at the time to net 2 free draws. Disc Commander could then be used as tribute fodder for Ryza or the Feared Light and Darkness Dragon. This format was essentially dominated by this deck, and no other deck really had any chance of beating Perfect Circle Monarch. And yet somehow, cutting through all of the rounds was a rogue Six Samurai deck piloted by Jonathan Moore. How was this possible? If I had to attribute any card to his success, it would have to be reasoning. With the varied levels that he ran alongside the general advantage of the unfamiliarity for his opponents with what level to call exactly, he could turn the tides tremendously with free samurai monsters and even great Shogun Shien. All of this put together, with a little bit of luck, pushed him through past all of the Monarch decks all the way to the top to become the champion of SJC Houston. While still thought to be a fluke by some, it still happened. And since then, Six Samurai have always been quite popular, even getting a complete overhaul in Storm of Ragnarok that brought them back to the competitive scene. They were in the metagame for a total of around 4 years, which has at least 8 formats. Quite an impressive feat. Moving on to number 6, we have Blackwings. Outside of Hero, Blackwings are a deck that is infamously blessed by the graciousness of Konami with constant support set after set. While most of the support isn't that great, the fact that the deck keeps getting new toys again and again has managed to keep the deck on life support for quite some time at least. Since their debut in 2009, Blackwings were able to dominate 2 formats before eventually winning Worlds. The deck slowly faded away a format or so after that, but it's still consistently a viable budget deck as a good choice. I, for one, know that Blackwings will probably get support until the day that this game dies. A lot of it has to do with the fact that Crow Hogan, a character in the 5Ds anime, was incredibly popular, so much so that the entire plot of the story was essentially changed and molded around him. Are you guys getting this? The plot of a Yu-Gi-Oh anime was changed for the sake of some random character that wasn't even the protagonist. From what I have read about this, he was originally supposed to actually turn to the side of the bad guys, but that never panned out. His immense popularity with the fans basically made the plot take a 180 and had him remain as a good guy, and he's stuck with it ever since. If you don't believe me, his popularity basically got him to return in a spot on a couple of episodes in Arc 5 in a duel against Shun. I won't spoil the duel for you, but there's a lot of bird-on-bird action in that duel. Moving on to number 5, we have Hero. Being on the topic of well-supported archetypes, we have the most well-supported archetype probably in the entire game here with Hero. Most beloved decks ever, spearheaded by the protagonist of Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, Jaden Yuki, and with the fan-favorite card, Elemental Hero Stratos. Hero has impacted every single era of the game except for the Duel Monsters era in some way, shape, manner, or form. There are so many decks that Hero have touched that in itself could be an entire video, talking about every single deck that Heroes have had an influence on. But here I'll just list some of the biggest influences that Hero has had on the game. Airblade Turbo, Perfect Circle Monarch, Dark Arm Dragon Return, Teledad, Zero Diva DAD, Little City Deck, Big City Deck, Bubble Beat, and the most recent Masked Hero deck. Continually, ever since 2007, Hero has made its presence known within our very game, and even to this day, Dark Law is still a threat in the format despite Hero not being a deck within the metagame. If you think about it, Hero technically is probably the longest lived deck on this list, having almost a decade of the spotlight to their name, but despite that, I think there are at least 4 other decks that I've picked above Hero, because each of these decks, for one reason or another, despite having maybe shorter lifetimes, have had much greater meta longevity and longer lasting influence on the game. This isn't to discount Hero at all though. I'm confident that with time, Hero will be a deck that constantly gets support alongside Blackwings and will probably be one of the longest lived decks in the game that we've ever seen, just because it'll probably come back maybe once every 3 to 5 years. It'll get new support that will bring it back to life. For number 4, we have Gladiator Beasts. This is a deck that basically went from almost nothing at its release in Gladiator Assault to having a cult following that is continuously fervent to this day. Gladiator Beasts existed in the metagame for nearly 4 years, but in that short span of time, they managed to become one of the most decorated decks of all time in the entire game. For 2 consecutive formats, Gladiator Beasts stomped the competition, winning 6 SJC events in a row and a total of 7 SJC events, a feat that is since only been replicated by the mighty Teledad, with an astounding 8 consecutive SJC wins. However, Gladiator Beasts have the prestige of winning Worlds on top of their mountain of achievements. To date, there is only one other deck that has won as many events as Gladiator Beasts, and that deck is Necros, which has tied Gladiator Beasts' record with 7 YCS wins. However, these were not consecutive wins, but Gladiator Beasts did have consecutive wins. In terms of dominance, Gladiator Beasts rank at the top with the best of the best as they asserted their dominance over the format with an iron rule of a Roman emperor. But dominance was not their only feature. The deck persevered continually as well, remaining within the meta for 4 formats at the very least through the end of 2010. Not only that, but they are the only deck that clashed against both the infamous Dark Arm Return and Teledad and survived to tell the tale. Let us take a moment out of respect for one of the greatest decks of all time. Moving on to number 3, we have Burning Abyss. Out of the modern meta decks, and by modern, I guess I'm referring to post-Duelist Alliance decks, Burning Abyss has been the deck that has clearly lasted and survived the longest. There are some inherent reasons to this, of course, but the ban list is a large factor into this as well. Shaddolls were another Duelist Alliance era deck that likely could have been good for a very, very long time as well, but the severe ban list hits cut its life short. Burning Abyss, on the other hand, was much more fortunate, and was treated graciously by the ban list, as well as receiving additional support cards that were incredibly useful for the deck. Each wave of support basically extended the life of this deck even further. Fiendish Rhino Warrior and Beatrice are the big guns that the deck has gained along the way, and the entire Phantom Knight engine, along with the Speedroid engine as well, have morphed the deck into what we know it as currently. Burning Abyss is a deck that will probably be very powerful for a long time if nothing further in the deck is hit by the ban list. There is basically no other deck in the game that can float as powerfully as Burning Abyss does, but the difference between it and other decks that float for a living is the fact that it can actually do substantial damage in the matter of a few turns. Not many, if there are even any other decks that can float on the level of Burning Abyss, can do the same amount of damage offensively as Burning Abyss can. Add to this the fact that the deck can be played in so many ways, from trap-heavy variants to no traps at all, and you have one of the longest lived decks that the game has ever seen, and it will likely live for a very long time more. Moving on to number 2, we have Mermail. When I think of longevity and the Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagame, the first deck that pops into my mind is none other than Mermail. The deck rose to prominence in 2012, and look at this, 4 years later, guess what? The deck is still relevant. What's unique about Mermail is that the deck is, by and large, very similar to the deck in its earlier release state. We see that several other decks with longer meta stints have had to change drastically to be able to compete and keep up with newer decks. But Mermail is overall not too much different than its 2012 self. I think part of this can be attributed to the fact that the win condition of the deck is dependent on a very fast and aggressive combo that outright kills the opponent no matter what they might have. This kind of deck doesn't really need to change much with time, so long as the combos that it's running can get around the meta. And with the exception of small blocks of time, such as the March 2013 format, Mermail has almost always been relevant during its lifetime. The sheer unbridled power and aggression of the deck is likely what keeps it a very good deck. Not to mention the fact that the deck is quite versatile and adaptable. It can win a majority of its games without even attempting to use the extra deck at all. But if it needs to, it can utilize the extra deck to nearly unrivaled potential, with access to all the powerful synchros of the game, as well as the rank 4 engine and the rank 7 engine, the two most powerful XYZ ranks in the entire game. All of this combined into one neat package makes Mermail one of the longest lived decks this game has ever seen. But of course, there is still one deck that has longer lived and has a greater legacy than Mermail. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some honorable mentions. Gravekeepers. Often referred to as the oldest archetype, although that title is more aptly belonging to Harpies nowadays, they have had ups and downs throughout the game. But despite this though, Gravekeepers have managed to rise into relevance with time, as the graveyard became more and more important, eventually peaking their career as a deck in 2010. But the deck still managed to hang on barely for another year. These days, Necro Valley still proves to be useful as a card that's used in demise decks like Cleafort and Yosenju, just because the power of Necro Valley is still unrivaled to this day. Exodia. Ever since that fateful moment in the anime, when Yugi pulled that come-from-behind win, Exodia has existed constantly as a deck that reminds us of the roots of our game. While it's a prominent icon, the deck has largely not been that successful at tournaments, though the deck has had quite a few shining moments. In Go Control format, for example, Exodia was actually really good as a deck though, despite very few people using it seriously. Most of this I found out by playing Exodia in Go format nowadays, looking with hindsight, but obviously you guys know that hindsight is 20/20. But there was one moment in time though, that Exodia nearly stole the entire show when Jarrell Winston was piloting the Hope for Escape Exodia deck at Worlds. And now, we move into our number 1 longest lived deck, Monarchs. This may or may not stir up controversy with people, most likely because they're arguing that the deck had so many variants throughout the ages that it might not be fair to count them as a single deck, but I disagree. Monarchs are more than a deck. They're a legacy in Yu-Gi-Oh! The legacy of tribute summoning, in fact. While there were many tribute summon decks back in the olden days, I would have to say that Monarchs were the landmark deck that changed the face of tribute summoning. In contrast to the older tribute monsters, which gave you either a really strong beat stick or a lockdown effect like Jinzo, Monarchs were the first case that tried to rectify the inherent problems involved with a tribute summon, which is namely the fact that you're taking a loss in card advantage. With the release of Zaborg, with his mighty afro though, he could alleviate this loss immediately upon summon, taking down any of your opponent's monsters, meaning that the cost of the monster that you just tributed was paid for right then and there. From there on out, any monsters that Zaborg destroyed in battle would be done at a plus, instead of the first being the point of where he breaks even. And from that point onward, in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh!, for those of you who don't know, Monarchs essentially dropped a metric ton of variants throughout the history of our game. I'll just list off a few of the more memorable variants. We have Zaborg and Friends, Dekoichi Monarch, which was basically Cornarchs named after the player Anne of Corn, Perfect Circle Monarch, Light and Darkness Dragon Monarchs, Frog Monarch, Formula Monarch, Quick Draw Monarch, Plant Monarch, Vanity and Majesty Fiend Stun, Shadal Monarch, Domain Monarchs, and now most recently, Xyz Monarchs. So as you can see, the sheer number of Monarch decks that have existed throughout the game is astounding, and it's not hard to see why. Monarchs took the most basic mechanic aimed at getting more powerful monsters to the field and actually made it viable as a strategy. It was one that basically could snowball the game. There was a build that I didn't mention, but it was based on this idea. It was called 12 Gauge Monarchs, and it used 12 Monarchs, kind of like the name. The strategy was to get a Monarch on the board and secure itself to be used as tribute fodder for the next Monarch, and the next one, and so on and so forth. At this point, I guess I should apologize because I'm basically essentially beating you over the head with the sheer idea that Monarchs were a very influential deck on the game. But in case you still don't understand, the simple fact is it had a lot of influence on the game. Okay, now I'm done with my spiel. But influence on the game is one thing. That doesn't necessarily correlate to longevity, which is the basis of this list. And those of you thinking that are right. But Monarchs have had a profound longevity. Zaborg was released on June 1st, 2004 in North America, and it proceeded to mark the birth of the Monarch deck. From that time forward, in almost every single year since then, you can pick any year, and most likely there will be a Monarch deck from that year that can be associated with some sort of influence and impact on the game. Fast forward to 2016 and take a look at the game. Monarchs are currently the most successful deck in the metagame right now, basically 12 years after their release. Maybe some people will still disagree with this judgment, but to me it's undeniable that this deck is the longest lived deck out of any deck in our game. With 12 years under its belt and it's still sitting at the cusp of the metagame, I don't see any other deck with a greater longevity than Monarchs.